I think a lot of people say, "Oh, I have a thyroid issue." And I know a lot of doctors will be like, "Oh, I think we got to check your thyroid. Got to check your thyroid." And I'm like, "All right, whatever." You know, people are always like, "Oh, that's a thyroid problem." I'm like, "Okay, I don't I
It's like those
all
people
right."
that can listen to your car running and say,
Yeah,
"Oh, you know
it's like,
what? You should
"Oh,
check the
that's
catalytic
the
converter."
catalytic converter." It's always, to me, it sounds the thyroid seems like a catalytic converter issue, something that I'm never gonna understand, and it could come out and I wouldn't know, and they'll charge me $750.
This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. Great to see you too.
Great to be here.
Hello.
Okay, on the show this week, the thyroid blame game.
What the hell is it?
Andrea, I love how you always
Hypothyroid,
say,
hyperthyroid.
Oh, I know.
Who knows? I always get confused, first of all, with those two words because I get confused very easily. But also, what is it? Is it in your? It's something in your. Is it in your neck?
Everybody's
Is it in your
talking
neck?
about it. I think that's a great place to start, Andrea.
Where is it?
Dr. Cooper, what in the world is the
What is it?
thyroid gland?
And why do I take medicine for
Well,
it?
the thyroid gland.
All right, I'm neglectful.
That thyroid gland is part of our endocrine system, meaning our hormonal system throughout the body. And it's actually located at the base of our neck. So
All right,
if you
that's close.
like kind of feel really softly with your fingers, you might feel it. If you feel too hard, you won't feel it. And it moves
In the front?
and it moves up and down when you swallow. And so it's below where you'll feel your like cricoid cartilage there. But it's way at the base. And it consists of like three sections. There's the right lobe, the left lobe, and then there's something called the isthmus, which is like the cross bridge between those two lobes. But it's one gland there. And it's responsible for a lot of things, like helping our temperature regulation stay balanced. Actually, it's really important in mental function because it prevents cognitive slowing of our thoughts and stuff. And it's important for intelligence as well, that it function well. And it also helps stimulate our metabolism to produce more energy, both in the short term and long term.
So you're saying this hormone, this little gland does all that by increasing levels and decreasing levels of thyroid?
Yes,
hormone?
Exactly.
Wow.
So how come people could live without it?
Well, fortunately, we have medication that is synthetic form of that hormone, of the hormones that the thyroid produces. But typically, the thyroid produces two hormones. They're nicknamed T4 and T3. Primarily, it produces T4 and just a little bit of T3. But in our circulation, the T4 converts to some amount of T3, which is like a shorter acting active form of the T4. So it can adjust it, as needed in the circulation, but it primarily produces this T4. And these two hormones, they feed back because, of course, like everything in the body that's a hormone or an endocrine gland, it's governed by signals from the brain, right? We've always talked about that. So it's the hypothalamus that receives like the levels of what your T4 and your T3 are doing in the bloodstream. And then it sends out a signal to the pituitary gland, which is also kind of in that brain area. It's a central endocrine organ, and it tells it whether or not to produce another hormone called TSH. So I'm just saying these names because people get these measured. So the thyroid produces T4, and in the bloodstream, some of it converts to T3, and the T4 and the T3, that are circulating go to the hypothalamus, which produces something called TRH, thyroid releasing hormone. That one we don't measure often, but then that stimulates the pituitary to produce TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. And the TSH tells the thyroid whether or not to produce more or less of the T4 and the T3. So if the thyroid stimulating hormone goes up, it will tell the thyroid gland to produce more T4. If the incoming signals look too high, the TRH goes down, which makes the thyroid stimulating hormone go down, which tells the thyroid to stop producing as much. So it's a feedback loop.
So, Dr. Cooper, when people come to you with metabolic dysfunction or metabolic syndrome, is it common to have a dysfunction in their thyroid?
It's interesting because the thyroid affects our metabolism, but metabolic dysfunction can affect our thyroid function too. And so sometimes you will see either two separate conditions, like maybe somebody who has both metabolic dysfunction that's affecting maybe their glucose, their insulin, their leptin, or things like that, but they also may have a thyroid problem as well that you're seeing. But then sometimes there's problems with the metabolism, like, for example, if your leptin is very low, or if you do have leptin resistance, your blood work can look like you have a thyroid problem that's originating from your thyroid when it may actually be your metabolism that's interfering with this thyroid function.
How do you tell?
Well, it's actually looking at the labs. The lab work really can tell you. Again, you want to look at, does this make sense? Here's the thyroid levels, and they're feeding back to the brain. So the brain should be putting out X amount of these output hormones, like our thyroid stimulating hormone, and yet it's not. Why is it not doing that? Well, could it be that your body's leptin that's supposed to be reassuring the brain that you weigh enough, could it be that it's too low, or that you're resistant to it, so your brain thinks you're starving? So your brain won't authorize your pituitary gland to send out that signal because it wants your metabolism to slow down, and it wants your thyroid to stay low because it doesn't want you to burn the fuel. It wants to lower your metabolism. So once again, you can't fool your brain into anything. It's all based on the perception the brain has of your fuel supply. So that's in the situation where the metabolism can influence your thyroid. But there's also many cases where the thyroid is diseased, and it's really just the thyroid that's not functioning well.
What are the most common reasons the thyroid gets goofed up and is either sending out too much or too little? I know a lot of people, I think my mom is on thyroid medication. But how do you know? Do you get hot flashes, or what are some of the symptoms that your thyroid might not be working
Well, the symptoms are kind of common things people complain about a lot. So you have to look further. But some key symptoms are fatigue. Feeling just tired is a very common symptom. And also things like brittle nails, hair loss, constipation. This is if your thyroid's too low. Constipation, muscle weakness, especially shoulders and hips. So for athletes, a lot of times they'll feel like they lost power. They're not able to put out that power that they were able to before. And poor muscle recovery, heat intolerance, cold intolerance, temperature regulation problems. Those are the most common types of symptoms that you see. And then the most common cause of it is hereditary. So you were saying your mom has, thyroid, and we screen all our patients' thyroid levels and things. But the hereditary form of thyroid disease is the most common, and it's due to autoimmune disease. So it's actually the body that makes these antibodies, the immune system, that start fighting your own thyroid gland and destroying it, basically. And that reduces its ability to function.
No, I was going to say, so you could be born with that. Does it get worse as you age, or does it stay the same?
Well, it's not It can occur at birth or in infancy. That's very unusual. And that's screened, all babies are screened for that at birth. It's unusual, but in childhood, it's important to discover it because it's been shown to reduce cognitive ability if it's not treated. If you have a child with low thyroid function that's not detected and not treated, they literally say the IQ levels are lower and everything. So that's a big concern. But that's not very common in early childhood. The autoimmune form is something that often will come on later in life. And that is the most common form, and it's hereditary. So it's that people have this genetic predisposition, but it's not activated yet. And some of the things that are thought to activate it are your immune system interacting with different things that trigger the immune system to accidentally produce those antibodies that fight your thyroid, that you're genetically capable of producing. So not everyone is genetically capable of producing those. But if you are, and you're exposed to certain viruses, common viruses actually, that can cause like respiratory disease, or now they're looking at certain foods maybe also, that could trigger an antibody reaction that turns on your thyroid problem, basically.
You talked about some of the symptoms of low thyroid levels. What about too much thyroid?
Yeah.
In the system?
Yeah. And too much is usually also due to an autoimmune problem where the antibodies are attacking the thyroid and causing it to, or attacking parts of that thyroid pathway and causing the thyroid to pump out too much hormone. And so the symptoms there are feeling very jittery. There can be a tremor, a very fine tremor of the hands or tongue. There can be pressure that builds up behind the eyes, and the eyes can protrude a little bit. There can be like a redness in the palm area that will create like a ring around the palm. And there can be sometimes weight loss and shakiness, anxiety, rapid heart rate. It just doesn't feel good. And some of the other similar symptoms of hair loss happen too. And in women, with the low thyroid, the menstrual cycle can be heavy, but in high thyroid, it can be absent, your menstrual cycle. So it has there's a lot of symptoms, and it's actually, it could be very dangerous. Both of them can be very dangerous if they're in a severe position, severely low or severely high.
So we've talked about some of the symptoms that people might feel, but then what do you do? How do you treat it?
Well, the low thyroid problems are, probably easier to treat because we have medication that's thyroid replacement hormone. And so typically the provider will prescribe T4, an artificial T4. You can get natural, like so-called natural T4 and T3, but it comes from like pig thyroid gland or cow thyroid gland. And I'm not a big fan of it, mainly because their glands don't produce the same ratio of T4 to T3 as ours do. So often there's too much of the T3 and not enough T4, and it's in one pill, so you can't adjust it. So typically, providers probably prefer to just do the T4, synthetic T4, by itself, because your body should be able to turn that into T3 in the bloodstream. You shouldn't have to take also T3. But there's like a big movement of people thinking they need huge amounts of T3. I mean, people sometimes are prescribed enormous amounts of T3 and to like improve their mood or their energy or for so-called weight loss. And it actually backfires because remember the feedback loop? Then you've got too high levels of this T3, which has a very strong impact in that feedback loop in the brain. And the brain will put the brakes on the thyroid T4 production because of that. It'll think your levels are too high, and then it ends up lowering your T4 very low. And so that really backfires, but it's a common like fad, I guess, that's going on for quote weight loss. So that's something to be aware of. It's not that no one needs T3. Some people do need to supplement T3 a little bit here and there, but it's not universal at all. Most often you don't need to take T3. But of course, consult with your doctor, look at your labs and decide what's right. One thing to keep in mind is, again, metabolic dysfunction, such as low leptin levels, high ghrelin levels, can actually interrupt your body's ability to convert the T4 to the T3. So having a low T3 can also be a sign of metabolic problems, not just thyroid problems. So, but anyway, when your thyroid is low, it's kind of easy to treat because you just can use these medications and monitor the blood levels. And if it's autoimmune, measuring these antibody levels is very helpful for the ones that are attacking your thyroid can be measured, and their levels can be monitored over time because it's the type of thing that can flare up and then it can calm down and flare up and calm down. So it can affect how much of the thyroid medication you may need. And some people have the antibody reaction, but don't end up needing to go on thyroid medication because their thyroid can still function and it's doing fine, and others don't. But that's the low thyroid condition. The high thyroid's a different story. It's a little harder to treat because you have to first use something that will pretty much prevent your thyroid from producing any thyroid hormones. You kind of have to, you could do that surgically, remove it, or you could use medication that destroys it basically. And then those patients have to go on a medication just like the people with low thyroid to replace the thyroid hormone. So it's a little bit more complicated. There's more steps and there's some side effects of some of those medications that are used. So that could be a concern and need more close monitoring.
I'm glad that you mentioned the T3 fad because, oh my goodness, almost every day I get some sort of ad on social media that deals with metabolism and here's the hack. And it's just so much baloney.
I see it too.
These supplements are completely unregulated by the government, aren't they?
And they make a lot of promises, a lot of promises. And they say that they're fantastic and will do all kinds of miracles.
Yeah. And, there are some key nutrients the thyroid needs, but we get most of that from our diet. You don't normally have to supplement things, although around the world, one of the primary causes of low thyroid is iodine deficiency. And because iodine is required for the thyroid to produce the T4. And
where do we get iodine?
Well, luckily someone thought about putting iodine in our salt, iodized salt. And so iodized salt is the primary source in our country. But what I've seen over the years, so this is another misconception that you hear in the medical community is that no one in the US has an iodine deficiency, or hardly anyone. But I see a lot of iodine deficient patients. And I think it's because people have switched over to like the different sea salts and stuff that's not iodized. Yeah. And so we do measure iodine levels. And there's first thing you look at is if, say, that thyroid stimulating hormone's high, but your thyroid output's not coming out, your T4 is low. Could that be because your iodine's deficient and you don't have the ingredients to make the T4? And so sometimes that does solve it. So we do measure that, but you have to watch out with iodine because too much iodine also suppresses thyroid function. So too little or too much. And that's similar to so many nutritional things. It's like there's a bell-shaped curve, where you want to be in the optimal zone. If it's too high or too low, it will produce the same problematic symptoms. And so that's why supplements are sometimes very difficult because they can be mega dosed. And that's not what we want, for this. But also, interestingly, to convert the T4 to the T3 requires selenium. And selenium is in,
where do we get that?
It's in like whole grains. And, it's in, most people are not going to be selenium deficient, I don't think. But it's another one that can be very toxic when supplemented too high. So if I see a problem with low T3 levels, I always ask our patients to just eat some Brazil nuts because that's the richest source of selenium that we can get in our diet. And so just eating like a small amount of Brazil nuts every day or most days. You're not a fan of Brazil nuts, no. But they are a good source. And then there's definitely other foods that have,
Well, that's interesting. You talk about iodized salt, Dr. Cooper,
I
I'm
gotta check because I don't eat. I'm
yeah.
all sea salt girl.
Yeah, we have all
But
these fancy salt grinders now that don't have iodized salt in them. You have me taking an iodine supplement
Mm-hmm.
where I take drops every
Yeah.
morning. Is that for other reasons in the metabolic loop,
That was
that
probably
iodine
it.
level?
No, that would be because, I don't have
Hmm.
your labs handy, but probably because we noticed that your TSH was a little elevated
Ah,
compared to your T4. And then we usually will check those antibodies and they were probably negative. So then we checked the
hmm.
iodine and it was on the low side. So that's why.
right.
So, and then we'll monitor it
That's
and make sure
interesting.
that stays.
Yeah.
And then usually you'll see the T4 perk up with just a little bit of
Hmm.
iodine. So
Huh.
there's these little tiny
I
things.
think I eat out enough where they use iodized salt.
Well, you know what's interesting? They may not be using iodized salt. It's a little more expensive, and our processed food doesn't have iodized salt. So that's interesting too.
Huh.
So I wasn't aware of that until I kind of researched it because I was surprised to find that. So
That's
hmm
interesting.
But it's pretty easy to see. Now, in infants and stuff, iodine deficiency also can cause that cognitive slowing and the low IQ by lowering your thyroid. So it's just really important to look at these things from multiple perspectives if you start seeing some irregularities there. And there's a popular, another fad like thing going around about reverse T3 being the big problem that's causing obesity. What people are referring to is the low T3 levels that occur, the low free T3 that's circulating, that's the active form. But that again is because of that metabolic famine signaling that's just on purpose making your body not produce that because it's trying to on purpose slow your metabolism down. So taking more T3 again is not going to be the answer to solve that. But I see a lot of patients that were told that and put on a lot of T3, which unfortunately, did you know that the high T3, the higher it goes, it actually suppresses your leptin more? So
Hmm.
it could actually create this vicious cycle that the very thing that was causing the problem is being made worse through that treatment that's not really targeting the main issue.
Is it pretty
Wow.
easy, Dr. Cooper, to figure out what your levels are when it comes to the thyroid? Is that a very basic blood work test that we can ask our doc to
Yes,
do?
it's very basic. Now, often they'll just monitor the TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary, and they may say, oh, this is fine, so you're fine. But with our patients who have these metabolic issues, we want to do a more comprehensive because we can see the effect of the other elements of the metabolism on the thyroid function. So again, you want to look at the TSH and the free T4 at least, and ideally the free T3 also, those three hormones. And if there's abnormalities there, look further at antibody levels and iodine levels to try to see if you can figure out why. And not every elevated antibody level problem would need to be treated because if your thyroid levels are okay, even though you have these elevated antibodies, you don't really need to treat it. You just need to keep monitoring and watching over time to make sure you don't get into any kind of trouble with your thyroid function.
And you
Wow.
touched on free. It seems like with a lot of these hormones, there's a free level, an available level, and then another kind of level. What's the difference
Yeah,
between that and that happens in other hormones,
it
right?
does. And a lot of it is, I think, that the totals are, it's almost like a holding tank
Hmm.
where it's going to convert it to the free on demand type of, delivery system. So you'll even see this with thyroid in people that are running races, for example. Literally, while they're running, their body is deciding to release some of these hormones into the free form to enable them to go faster. And so it's kind of that holding tank. So there's a lot of different actions that could inhibit or stimulate to move from the total level into the free available.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
I know with my
yeah.
testosterone levels, that was the case, that there's the total level, but then the free amount is really what's key,
Well,
right?
they both are. The
Ah,
free can have a little bit more impact in the short term. It can fluctuate more, but that total level's also having, action, but it's more of a
hmm.
stable constant. And the free is more responsive acutely.
So I've heard about people who they think they have a thyroid problem, so they cut out gluten altogether because they think that might be the cause or that's related or something. There's a gluten thyroid issue. What's the science
Well,
on that?
when you think about it, the hypothyroid we talked about is autoimmune. So there's antibodies that are produced. And the actual name, that it's referred to as is Hashimoto's thyroid disease. So you may have,
Oh, I've
yeah.
heard about that a
So
little bit.
yeah,
I
we
don't
didn't
really know what it
mention
is, but I've heard it.
that name earlier, but that's what most hypothyroid, most low thyroid is due to is Hashimoto's. And it's this autoimmune, just like we've been talking about. And once you have one autoimmune condition, it does often connect you to the increased risk of developing other autoimmune problems or of uncovering other autoimmune issues in your life. And so some of those could be things like celiac disease. So people with autoimmune thyroid problems may also have celiac disease, which is an actual real problem with gluten where you have to completely avoid gluten because of an antibody reaction to gluten. So there are a subset of people who have both celiac disease and Hashimoto's thyroid problems or hypothyroidism. And those people should definitely avoid gluten. But there's kind of been a mistaken thinking that everyone with a thyroid problem should avoid gluten. And that's not been proven. It really has not. There have been some studies that showed that people who have either celiac or a real sensitivity to gluten, the antibody reaction they're getting to the gluten, their immune system saying, ooh, what is this stuff? Gluten, I'm reacting to it. That could cross react with some of these thyroid antibodies and could affect your thyroid function. So that has been seen for a subset of people that have really high sensitivity to gluten or have celiac disease. But for the vast majority of people, there really is no evidence that there's any kind of effect at all in eating gluten containing foods. And so I don't really like when things become so widespread of people eliminating gluten. And you'll see some of these headlines like that are just so there's definite evidence of this, and it's just not true. So beware of the headlines. And I wouldn't eliminate any food if you can avoid it, other than for a very specific necessary reason. Because once you eliminate like those complex carbs, now you could be increasing your risk of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and even missing some of those key trace minerals that are needed for healthy thyroid function. So it doesn't make sense to start eliminating the foods. And often people on the gluten-free diets, if they're not really aware, they may be consuming an awful lot of rice products. And rice is great, but it is a crop that takes up a lot of arsenic from the soil. And so you do have to be concerned about arsenic exposure if your diet is heavily, laden with rice as an alternative to the gluten. So anyway, I prefer if people don't eliminate gluten in my practice, unless there's a very key reason to. And we usually, with our patients, we explore those reasons and whether there really is a good reason to eliminate it or not. But the risks versus benefits are really, it doesn't add up.
Yeah, for those people with celiac disease, it's a real thing. But I mean, I feel like gluten has been given such a bad name that everyone thinks they should avoid gluten, but it's a protein from wheat, right? I mean,
Right.
so our body can use that in a really good
Well,
way.
yeah,
Right. People are really mean to
it
gluten.
it is
It's not poison.
well,
Especially at those restaurants in LA.
I know. It's not poisonous. It's
and
delicious.
it's like a lot of things. The studies that have been done more recently are showing that the more gluten-containing foods you eat, the lower your risk of diabetes and obesity.
Oh,
Yes,
that I should have been
Uh,
I should
yeah,
have
the
been
more
free and clear.
gluten and the lower animal proteins, that has been shown, especially in men, to reduce the risk of diabetes and obesity. But we might get some hate mail because there's just so many people invested in gluten free. So I know that that's a very touchy topic that I run into on a daily basis, but I still, look at the research and see all of it. And gluten is actually so beneficial just because once you start cutting it out, you're eliminating so many great whole grain products and whole grains that those are so healthy for us, so good for our health in so many ways.
All right. This has been such a fun conversation. The thyroid blame game. Andrea, any parting thoughts?
I think we've learned a little bit about what it really means, and you can't blame everything on one thing. There's so much that you have to learn.
Yeah, I've learned a ton, Dr. Cooper, about what the thyroid is, and it's not like the appendix, right? You can't just cut it out and go on with your life. It has
No.
such a key role in regulating our entire bodies. Do you have any parting thoughts, Dr. Cooper, as we
Well,
wrap
I
up?
think that people think that, oh, if my weight's high and I'm tired, it must be my thyroid. And we hear that all the time. But even though it's common to have low thyroid, it's much more common to have other metabolic problems that are affecting your energy and your weight. So don't be disappointed if it turns out that it wasn't your thyroid and there doesn't seem to be an answer, because there usually is another underlying metabolic reason for these problems.
All right. That's it as we wrap up the thyroid blame game. Thanks, Dr. Emily Cooper and Andrea Taylor, for another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper, a Work P2P production. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.